Story 1. A cousin decided to take a different route home because traffic looked bad. Just a few blocks away, they were in a crash that left them paralyzed. One small choice in the moment rewrote their entire future. Story 2. One day my uncle said he wanted to come over and talk with my dad, but my dad couldn't because he was taking me and my sister to the theater to see Coco. Turns out my uncle was struggling mentally and went missing less than a week later. We still haven't found him. I often wonder if we hadn't gone to the movies, would my dad have talked him out of it? Story 3. The invention of the modern pregnancy test made the old method obsolete. That method involved injecting urine from a suspected pregnant woman into a frog. If the frog laid eggs, she was pregnant. Once the frogs were no longer needed, and with conservation efforts in the 1950s and 1960s still in their infancy, laboratories around the world released these frogs into the wild indiscriminately. The species was native to Africa and had skin resistant to certain fungal pathogens that occur naturally on amphibians. Amphibians lacking this immunity worldwide were exposed to the fungus carried by the released frogs. That fungus has since ravaged amphibian populations worldwide, causing endangerment and extinction for more than 100 species. Many of those species are gone as an indirect result of the development of modern pregnancy tests. Story 4. I boarded an intercity bus in China and was about to sit near the middle, but a Chinese woman in the seat behind me gestured for me to move to the back. I looked up and saw other white passengers whom I did not know, so I moved to the back. After a few hours on the road, we were in a horrific accident in which about half of the side of the bus was crushed. If I had sat where I originally intended, I would have been killed. Story 5. The girlfriend of my lifelong best friend had an erotic dream about my brother, whom she had never met. A week or two later, the four of us went out for a drink on a Sunday evening. It was a very pleasant evening and everyone had fun. When we left, my brother and my best friend used the men's restroom. The girlfriend got into the driver's seat and I sat in the back. My best friend came out next, and as a joke I told him to sit in the back with me because it would be funny to have my brother up front given the earlier dream. On the way home we were in an accident and my best friend died. Neither driver had been drinking. I still agonize over the role I played in his death. Given the seating arrangement, it was either my best friend or my brother who would have been in that seat. In short, she had an erotic dream about someone she had never met, and that set off a chain of events that cost her boyfriend his life. She later committed suicide. Story 6. My brother told a girl, who was dating his friend, that she could stop and stay with us during Thanksgiving while they were driving to see the friend. He did not tell us that was the plan and tried to sneak her into the house. He was caught, and although I strongly objected to her staying with us because it seemed inappropriate, my mother felt sorry for her and let her stay because it was the holidays. During the stay, my brother got her pregnant, and my mother again showed empathy and invited her to live with us after her family kicked her out. She later had an affair with my mother's husband and became pregnant by him. My parents are now divorced, and the woman refuses to let my mother see the child because my mother had kicked her out. Story 7. This is more bittersweet than sad. My brother died suddenly and unexpectedly in his early 20s. My parents had been saving money for him because he was disabled and would need care after they died. Since he no longer needed the money, they split it between my sister and me. The money was life-changing. It was not enough to buy a house outright, but it helped a lot. My husband and I had been undecided about having children, but we could not afford it, so it seemed unlikely that we would try. Within a year of my parents giving us the money, we had moved into a new home, and within 2 years we had our first child. My father thinks it is so sad that my brother will never meet his nieces because he loved babies. I can never tell my parents that they have grandchildren, because their son died. Story 8. My brother was sent to a juvenile rehabilitation facility. He asked me to take care of his dog, Buck, while he was there and to make sure Buck got adequate exercise. The week before his scheduled release, he got into an altercation with another resident and had to stay an additional 2 weeks. The day after his original scheduled release, I took Buck for a run. I think he may have been bitten by a spider or gotten into something he should not have because he did not make it through the night. I remember waking my dad around midnight and telling him that Buck had died. My dad was such a great man. He woke up 2 hours early to give Buck a proper burial before going to work. I will always wonder whether that would have happened if my brother had been released on schedule. Story 9. I guess this is the opposite. A substitute teacher told us about a friend who had a bus ticket to a convention. Something came up and he could not make it, so his seat was left empty. The bus was in a wreck. There were no major injuries, but a metal beam pierced the seat his friend was supposed to occupy. Story 10. My grandmother once told me about how she did not go on a date with a man because she was busy with chores. A year later, he died in an accident. She always wondered if her life, and mine, might have been completely different if she had gone. Story 11. My grandparents' first son did not look both ways when crossing the street in 1943. He was struck by a car rolling downhill with its engine off to conserve gasoline, and he lingered for 3 days before passing. He was only 7 years old. Because of that accident, my grandparents spoiled my mother and Uncle rotten, and as a result, I no longer speak to my mother. Story 12. I often wear headphones when I walk my dog, but I misplace them a lot and sometimes walk without them. One day, I insisted on finding my headphones and searched for more than 10 minutes, even though my dog was whining to leave. As soon as we stepped off the porch, an officer ran toward us, yelling for us to go back inside. The next day, I learned the house we would have passed if we had left 10 minutes earlier had multiple bullet holes in the door. I am usually fine walking without music, but that intense need that day saved my nosy, loud dog and me from being caught in the middle of a dispute. Story 13. I was diagnosed with cancer and have been on medical leave for a year. After I stopped working, things at my workplace began to go wrong. Money went missing and lottery tickets were unaccounted for. Now my former manager is being charged with 2 felonies. I do not know whether I would have noticed it if I had still been there, or whether someone might have set it up to make it look like I was involved. I was questioned, but I could prove I was not near the store when most of the incidents took place. The former manager is a good person, and it is hard for me to believe they would do this, but there is a lot of evidence that I cannot deny that something happened. Story 14. A 17-year-old Austrian boy was rejected from art school. Story 15. The trailer park I used to live in had a lot of trees. Some of them were in poor condition. The worst offender, which was also the largest, curved over my neighbor's roof. We used to sit on the porch and joke about it falling one day. It looked dangerous. After a while, my neighbor called the landlord to do something about the trees. They eventually sent people out to inspect and cut them down. After inspecting the trees, they decided to cut down one and leave the rest, including the large one over his roof. My neighbor walked around and took pictures of all the trees they should have removed and planned to contact them again. A week passed. A severe thunderstorm came through late at night. My neighbor was asleep in his recliner while his wife and their 3-year-old were in bed. At some point, his wife woke to go to the bathroom, leaving their son with him in the recliner. Before she even left the bathroom, the tree fell through the roof, killing my neighbor and his son. To make a long story short, one lawsuit led to another, and everyone had to move, trailers and all. The trailer park is now just an empty field. Story 16. My cousin turned 17. She went with her parents to get a car for her birthday. They bought a used Ford Escape from a dealership and drove off the lot. The car suddenly accelerated and would not stop. She maneuvered along a main road at increasing speed, dodging cars with completely uncontrolled acceleration. She avoided other vehicles but lost control, clipping a minivan at over 90 miles per hour with a family inside. Her maneuver saved the family, but the car flipped and she died within a day. Ford attempted to seize the vehicle for an investigation, but the family and the local sheriff insisted on impounding it in a secure lot. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, the sheriff, and a lawyer investigated and found, using cameras inside the wrecked car, that the accelerator cable was snagged. Ford had previously recalled the Escape, but the earlier repairs created a new problem. Accelerator cables could snag on an engine part and cause uncontrolled acceleration. Investigators found that Ford knew this and that the issue had already caused serious accidents and deaths. Yet the company initially decided not to issue another recall. Ultimately, Ford was forced to recall 500,000 Escapes at great cost to permanently fix the issue and prevent cable snags. My cousin's 17th birthday led to a major vehicle recall by a large automaker in 2012. She also helped a reporter earn a Peabody Award. More details and footage show the caught cable at about the 3-minute mark in the coverage. If you know anyone with a Ford Escape, please make sure their car has had this issue fixed at a dealer. Story 17. One night I decided to take my parents' dog for a walk to blow off some steam because I was angry and frustrated with the person I had been seeing. They had failed to show when we were supposed to meet that evening and had not responded to any of my calls or messages. I finally heard from them while I was out, and they sent me on a massive guilt trip because they had been taking care of their mother, who had cancer. Because I was so upset and not thinking clearly, I missed crossing the road where I normally cut through the alleyway to avoid walking past the house on the corner with an aggressive dog. I noticed that they had finally replaced their barely standing, hole-filled paling fence with a corrugated iron one, so I thought it would be safe to walk past with my parents' dog. Unfortunately, because it was dark, I could not see the huge gap between the bottom of the fence and the ground, so the dangerous dog was able to grab my parents' dog's nose when he was calmly sniffing the fence line. I had to get down on my hands and knees and pull with all my strength to separate them. Because of the call from the person I had been seeing, my phone was at less than 5%. I tried calling both my parents and my aunt who lives across the road, but nobody answered. I left a very frantic message on my parents' answering machine about what had happened just before my phone died. I said I could not wait any longer and that I would start walking home with their dog because he was bleeding profusely. Unfortunately, he is too big and heavy for me to carry, so I had to force him to walk the rest of the way home. I think my mother must have only just heard the message I left as I was getting home, because she rushed out of the house just as I was arriving and called for my father to bring towels and to back the car out of the yard so we could take their dog to the emergency veterinarian in the next town. When we got there, the veterinarian offered to euthanize my parents' dog because the damage to his face was so extensive, but she said that if they chose, she would do her best to save him. Of course, they chose to try. There was not much tissue for her to work with, but she was able to reconstruct one of his nostrils so he could breathe through his nose, and she neatened everything else up as best she could. I had before and after pictures because it is hard to describe what their dog looks like now, but basically he is missing 4/5 of his nose and his flews are completely gone, so his teeth are always visible. It has been a bit over 6 years, and he is still going strong. I like to say that he is the world's most expensive free to a good home dog, but the cost to save his life was totally worth it. It turns out the person I had been seeing was a con artist. He scammed several $1,000s out of me and drained my bank account. He had lost every job he had from stealing, but it had been kept under wraps because his father is an influential person in our community. I was not the only one he had conned, but I was the only one who went to the police. Unfortunately, nothing ever came of that, and I did not get all my money back. The best part is that his mother never even had cancer. Story 18. Anthony Weiner's addiction to sending unfaithful selfies caused irrational import taxes that continue to ravage our economy 9 years later. Story 19. Al Gore, the climate activist, narrowly lost to George W. Bush in the 2000 election by the smallest margin. Single votes were settled by the Supreme Court. He would not want the oil in the Middle East. Story 20. My uncle decided to switch his heart medication before the holidays because his old medication made him tired. He was supposed to take the new medication under supervision the first time. He rushed to leave because he and my cousin were going to their holiday cabin to prepare it for the family and wanted to shorten the trip. He took it the night they arrived and had a severe allergic reaction to something in the new medication that he and his doctor did not think to test for, since an allergy to it is rare. My cousin called an ambulance quickly, but he went into a coma on the way to the hospital. He remained in a coma for weeks, and the brain damage was so severe that he would have been bedridden for the rest of his life if he ever woke. He had specific requests if he was ever on life support, and they were honored. I do not think my aunt and cousins will ever shake that trauma. The person who was with him that night already struggled with mental health, and this broke them completely. I wish there were something that could give them peace, but I know that would be impossible without time travel. Story 21. For 100 million years ago, some asshole fish decided to grow legs, and now I have to pay taxes. Story 22. A gentle ape tried to comfort a child. Now Nazis are marching in the streets again. Story 23. I made a friend on Reddit through a vintage motorcycle repair subreddit. We started hanging out at a local bar. My friends met his friends. One of his friends met my roommate and they started seeing each other. It was a very intense but troubled relationship. They both seemed to be coping by drinking more. One night they were drunk. The girlfriend was smoking a cigarette and tossed the butt. It fell between the slats in the deck onto a mattress my roommate did not know was there. They went to bed. None of the smoke detectors were working, so the fire had already engulfed the back of the house by the time any of us woke up. My roommate's girlfriend did not make it out. Story 24. Trigger warning. Sexual assault. At the last minute and on a whim last year, I decided to go to a pride event at a swingers club with a friend. It was not as queer as I had hoped, and at the end of the night, while my friend was hooking up with someone, I was raped. This caused a mental health crisis that led me to blow through all my savings. I lost my job 2 weeks later for unrelated reasons, and within months I had to move back to my home state to avoid homelessness. Story 25. Quite literally a butterfly effect. I always think of that poor toddler who chased a butterfly onto a railroad track behind her home. If it had fluttered in another direction, she would not have been killed. Story 26. A deeply misguided teenager fell in with a bad crowd of radicals who turned to violence to advance their aims and sought to assassinate a government official. Ironically, the very person whose later ascension to the throne would have been more favorable for their people became the target. The group plotted an assassination, but his collaborator failed in an attempt to throw a grenade and wounded members of the Archduke's entourage before the target's car sped off and continued the planned itinerary. After this failure, the teenager left the scene. The Archduke insisted on visiting the wounded at the hospital, but this change was not communicated to the driver in a language he understood. On his way home, the boy stopped at a local grocer for a sandwich. As he exited Schiller's, a car stalled directly in front of him because the driver had taken a wrong turn and needed to reverse to reach the hospital. The boy, Gavrilo Princip, drew a gun from his pocket and shot Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife, setting in motion a chain of events that led to 2 world wars, the deaths of hundreds of millions of people, the rise and fall of the Nazis in the Soviet Union, and the geopolitical order that still troubles us today. Modern historians note that while the elements for this sequence were present, they caution against reading history deterministically. The war was not inevitable. A unique set of circumstances made this diplomatic crisis different from those of the previous decade. Had the grocer mixed up the order, or had it taken the assassin another minute in the shop, or had the assassin gone elsewhere so that the assassination did not take place, we would likely live in an entirely different world. I find it difficult to believe that an alternate timeline could be as bleak as the historical one. Story 27. These stories are why I have decision fatigue and anxiety. Story 28. Not too bad, but when I lived in a different state, my roommate and I went to the mall. The weather was unpleasant and we had not left the house in a while. I felt really sick partway through our shopping trip, so we left earlier than expected. We needed to pick up cat food on the way home, so we drove past our apartment complex to the store. At the intersection just before the store, we were completely stopped with our seatbelts on when the car behind us plowed into us at 35 miles per hour. Our car spun across the lane and hit another vehicle. Finally, everything came to a stop and we were in the opposite lane of traffic. My roommate's car was totaled and I had to go to the emergency room because I hit my head on the dash. While I did not have a concussion, the spot on my forehead still feels uncomfortable to the touch. Story 29. My grandmother married her childhood sweetheart at the beginning of World War II. She became pregnant and he left to fight. He was killed and my grandmother had a stillborn baby. She was horribly traumatized and remarried a few years later, but she did not love her new husband. She went on to have 3 more children, but her mental health suffered, and she was an absent and angry parent. Her new husband worked away for most of the year and focused on his hobbies when he was home, compounding the situation by leaving my traumatized and mentally unwell grandmother to raise 3 children alone. My mother grew up neglected in a home full of conflict and no love. It damaged her, and in turn she became an absent and cruel mother. I did not meet my extended maternal family until my late 30s. My sister was so affected by our childhood that she can barely hold a job. It is astonishing that a single death in the war has had such a devastating effect on 4 generations of my family. Intergenerational trauma is awful. I was told she had a stillborn baby at 9 months gestation. I wonder if the baby was born alive but taken for adoption, since my grandmother was a young widow with no other children. Nobody knows of a grave, which seems odd. Story 30. Donald Trump's victory in 2016 set me on the path to witchcraft. Story 31. Donald Trump's election and subsequent reduction of financial support to the United Nations caused me to lose my dream job when I was 8 months pregnant. I thought I had everything planned. I had just signed a 2-year contract, and we were finally financially able to have a child. Story 32. It's been 21 years and I still think about it almost every day. My live-in boyfriend went out all night and lied about where he was. I asked him to move out because I was not going to put up with that. He begged to come home a few days later, but I said no. I thought I was being strong and standing my ground. I had every intention of letting him come home, but I thought he had not learned his lesson. He was shot and killed that night while getting gas. I'm sorry, Jerry. I should have let you come home. Butterfly effect. My selfish choices caused his parents to bury their child, his children to grow up without a father, and the world to miss out on a great guy. If I had said yes and forgiven him, life would have been different. At least he would have had one. Story 33. My great-grandfather was driving his covered wagon across the Mississippi. Inside the wagon were his wife and children. The wagon overturned and they were all lost. My widowed great-grandfather remarried my great-grandmother, and therefore I exist. Whether this is sad depends on my state of mind. Story 34. A young man on my school bus always caught my interest. One day in my senior year, I decided to sit next to him and talk. That sparked a friendship that later developed into mutual feelings. I broke up with a decent boyfriend and began a relationship with him. He followed me to college and we lived together. I was not the best partner, but he became possessive, emotionally abusive, manipulative, and later sexually assaulted me every day. He claimed he did not, but I would say no and he would guilt me into sex, not stopping until I eventually gave in. Took me a while, but I eventually got away from him. If I had not decided to talk to him on the bus that day, I would have never experienced the worst trauma of my life. Story 35. A man who lived down our street was on his way to Hillsborough for the Football Association Cup semi-final between Liverpool and Nottingham Forest. He had a ticket for the Leppings Lane end. He was hit by a car on his way there and spent the day in the accident and emergency department with minor injuries. He watched the tragedy unfold from his hospital bed, knowing he would probably have died if he had made it to the match. Story 36. My father was the youngest of 12 children. His parents only had him because the next oldest sibling died as a child. Story 37. I moved from North Carolina to Ohio for a woman I had known for 2 months. She left me a week later. I stayed because I had a good job at a recovery center. I met a man and texted him when he got out of treatment. He was the first man I dated and truly loved. I became pregnant and had an abortion. If I had never moved to Ohio, I would never have met him. It feels like I ruined my life because of the grief from the abortion, the way he treated me, and how much I loved him. Story 38. My sister's friend was walking home from high school and decided to take a shortcut along a faster road because it was her dad's birthday and she wanted to get home quickly. She had her headphones on when a car that ran off the road struck her from behind. Story 39. At my high school, a teacher was running a class on machinery while some students were not paying attention. Some parts rotate at dangerously high speeds, so they needed to be careful for everyone's safety. They had not secured a component properly. It began to spin, and when the teacher went to inspect it, a pointed metal piece struck his head. He died instantly. I heard the news from a friend. It happened about 2 or 3 years after I graduated. Story 40. It's surprising that most people don't know what the butterfly effect is. Simple cause and effect and simple consequences are not the same thing. Story 41. This story always messes me up. I will use made-up names. I worked in a restaurant with Abby and Griffin. They were married, and Abby was related to the restaurant owner. Two of the servers, Georgia and Jim, had an affair that resulted in a baby, Natalie. Jim had a large family, and his wife made him move out of state, so he never took responsibility for the child. Georgia was using drugs, lost control, and was incarcerated, so Child Protective Services removed Natalie when she was 3. The owner of the restaurant decided to adopt Natalie, but the owner was elderly, so after a couple of years Abby and Griffin took guardianship. Abby and Griffin raised Natalie as their own and eventually had a son. Natalie often called Griffin Dad. When Natalie was 11, Abby died of cancer, leaving Griffin to care for the children. Around the time Natalie turned 13, we learned Griffin had been sexually molesting her for an unknown period. Story 42. Mitt Romney's loss in 2012 set us on the path to the current-day Trump dictatorship that we have come to accept. It illustrates the tyranny of the far right and how many Americans would rather step on others than help them up. Story 43. I don't know if this counts. I put Fruit Loops under the welcome mat at our front door. A man conducting surveys stepped on them, heard the crunch, and picked them up to inspect what he had crushed. My mom answered the door while I was laughing hysterically in the front yard. I know this might not count, but I had to share it. Story 44. The Big Bang occurred, setting in motion a chain of events that led to all the sadness that has ever occurred and will occur. Story 45. Type 2 diabetes runs in our family. Dad had been managing his diabetes for years, but couldn't lower his blood sugar to a safe level. 2 years ago, someone recommended a diabetologist. His treatment plan worked well for me, and my parents decided to switch to him too. Along with the change in medicines, the clinic put us on a restrictive diet. Mom and I took the medicines regularly but mostly ignored the diet because we felt it drained our energy. Dad followed the diet strictly. What none of us realized then was that he soon started to show symptoms of hypoglycemia. A month later, while walking our dog, Dad had a bad fall and hit his head on the pavement. He tried to hide it, but a couple of days later he began walking oddly. When we asked, he played it off as a minor injury. Over the next weeks he had more falls at work and at home, hiding all but the last one. He also began having trouble controlling his bladder. We told the diabetologist. The doctor changed his medications but said little else. Soon after, he was hospitalized with a stroke. Although he recovered, he became more susceptible to them. A few months later, a second stroke led to severe fluid retention, especially in his feet and lungs. He never fully recovered but insisted on leaving the hospital. The third stroke proved fatal. He died 4 days later. I blame myself for a lot of this. I introduced Dad to the diabetologist. I didn't notice the hypoglycemia symptoms sooner. I didn't get him to the hospital when I felt it was necessary. I argued with him and with Mom that the falls and the loss of bladder control were serious, but they were stubborn and I was worn down from arguing. If I had pushed harder and taken him to the hospital sooner, he might still be with us. It's been a year since he passed, and I'm still racked with guilt. Story 46. A cousin by marriage killed a young man in self-defense while protecting his younger siblings. The young man had dated a woman I worked with and was friendly with her older brother and her father. She later took her own life because of what happened. I had seen her at work days before, and being so closely connected feels wrong. Story 47. I sent an Instagram post to my best friend calling him a ladies' man and wrote that when he died I would say that, even though his life was cut short, his mind had still been on the girls. I cannot write the exact words because they are not in English. Apparently later that night he was hospitalized with influenza, and early the next morning he died from anaphylaxis. Story 48. If I had not ended the relationship with my ex, he would be alive today. Story 49. Homo sapiens interbred with Neanderthals. Now there is an orange one sending my money to Israel. Story 50. We had 2 attics in our house, and our cat got into one of them. We heard her crying but could not find her anywhere in the house. She seemed to be hiding or weak. My sister found her the next morning. She had died from the heat. I do not know how we missed her. It really hurts to lose an animal like that. Story 51. I randomly asked out a woman I had never met. That was 37 years ago, and we have been married for over 35 years. Story 52. Child abuse has unbelievably devastating, lifelong consequences for children who experience it. It affects everyone around them and society as a whole. Story 53. They made us study this exact thing in elementary school. Have you ever heard the history of the United States? Story 54. Content note: death of a loved one. My friend was a reckless guy who always did dangerous things and rarely considered the consequences. One early morning after a long night at a bar, he decided he was too drunk to try to walk home and wanted to be responsible. So he took a taxi. A few seconds after he sat down in the taxi, a drunk driver fleeing from the police crashed into the front of the taxi and killed my friend instantly. He did not have time to buckle his seatbelt. Story 55. My uncle was a heavy drinker. My family believed alcohol would take his life. However, he was murdered in our family cabin in the mountains because another family was jealous of our land. The case remains unsolved, but the community knows who did it. Story 56. Well, I do not care. Be prepared. Stay alert while you can. I am not asking questions. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.